Hello and welcome back to the channel Airbus What's It Doing Now. Apologies, it's been a little while since I put a video out, and that's because I've been a little bit poorly for the last 2 or 3 weeks, which has been a bit grim, but back and fighting fit and ready to go. So I thought it's about time we put another tech presentation out, because we haven't looked at tech for a little while. Don't worry, there's lots of other stuff coming from the channel, and whilst I was at home, I was able to do some background work on some of the Command Ground School videos, so you can expect to see that coming soon, particularly when we're looking at diversion planning, etc. So anyway, this is going to be about anti-ice. So a nice, hopefully straightforward one to break us back into things nice and gently. And the reason that I'm doing this as an audio file rather than a visual file is I'm sat here in my Santa onesie, and I don't think it's fair to subject you to that quite yet. Maybe later on in the month. Right, okay, so let's get into it then. We're taking a look at anti-ice today, and as always, I like to do an overview, but this is a slightly different overview because we're going to go back to ground school, really, from our ATP, and we're going to look at the different types of ice formation, where we might see that in the atmosphere, what causes it, and as always, the best thing, I think, is prevention better than cure. So if we know where we would expect icing, then obviously, if we have to pass through it, we have to pass through it, but at least we know what to expect and the types of icing that we might experience. So we're going to have a look at that to kick off with. Then we're going to take a look at what systems are on the aircraft to protect us from the icing phenomena and the various types. And then we're going to have a look at the faults that you might see or you might experience when the various anti-ice systems fail. Now, on some parts of this, particularly when you're looking at pitot icing faults, and the combinations that you might see are quite exhaustive. So when you look through the FCOM, and I'm just not going to go into each and every one of those because they follow a very similar theme, which I'll come on to later on. So if you want to know more about this, in the intricacies of the various different types of failures you might get, by all means look at the FCOM, but I'm not going to go into that in that much detail in this video. Good, all right, so let's start off then with the different types of ice. And the 3 different types I'm going to talk about today is clear ice, rime ice, and mixed ice, which, as you can imagine, is a mixture of the two, really. I've got some presentations here, some pictures and things that I've grabbed off the internet, and some of my own files to sort of help give you to visualize some of this stuff. So it makes things a little bit easier. So let's kick off then with clear ice. And clear ice, I think, is probably the worst of the different types that you might experience. This is where you will experience, or you would experience this type of icing when the water droplets are quite large. So typically in cumulus type cloud, large towering cumulus, or CBs. Of course, we avoid those anyway, don't we? But it's in those sorts of large cumuliform cloud where these large water droplets tend to appear. And what happens with these is that they're able to actually exist in their liquid form in much lower temperatures. So what happens is this cold aircraft wing hits this water droplet. Some of it freezes initially on impact, but the real dangerous thing here is that then, as the rest of the water droplet then continues over the surface of the wing, it then freezes as it rolls back. So you get a much larger surface area of icing, which is, I think, probably the more dangerous of the type of ice that you get, because it can cover quite a large area. Now, it's called clear ice. It's not clear. I mean, you can see it. It still has that frosty, opaque kind of appearance, as you can see from some of the pictures here. But as I say, it covers quite a large surface area. It's quite nasty stuff. It's hard. well, all ice is, and it's heavy because, of course, it's made from larger water droplets and it's covering quite a large surface of the wing. So, yeah, clear ice, not very nice at all, and you'll experience those typically in those cumulus types of not exclusively. Some of the really thick nimbostrata stuff that clouds a lot of rain, sometimes you can experience it in there, but typically in that cumuliform cloud where you experience those super cooled water droplets. You also might find them in I should be talking about this later on really, but as I'm talking about it now, I may as well say it. You also tend to find them in frontal conditions. So warm front, as you know, warm air can hold much more moisture. When it rolls over the top of cold air, or cold air cuts underneath it, that warm air then starts to condense. It then falls into that colder air, into the sort of sub-freezing layers. Because it's a large water droplet, it exists as a larger droplet in those icing conditions, and then you fly through that through to that front, and that's where you can pick up those conditions. So, as I say, not exclusively in cumuliform, sometimes in frontal conditions as well. So they're the things to sort of look out for. Rime ice, slightly different. So this is a very rapid freezing. So with clear ice, it was a impact and then it spreads over the wing over a large area. This is freezes almost instantly on impact. So they're much smaller water droplets, usually sort of drizzle. It's actually a thicker, more dense white appearance, the sort of the sort of thing you might scrape out of your freezer. I know that's frost, but it's got that much deeper white texture and context to it. It's normally in a more sort of isolated part of the wing, so it might sort of stick to the leading edge, for example. It's much rougher and but more of an aggressive looking sort of ice. Again, nasty stuff, but it doesn't spread over the wing like clear ice does. 'Cause much smaller droplets freeze on impact, and you get that sort of gnarly, frosty, sharp, edgy looking stuff on the leading edges of the surface, usually confined to the leading edges. Anyway, it's all nasty stuff. None of it's good. And then the mixed is a combination of the two, as you'd expect. So sometimes during mixed conditions, the ice droplets, sometimes you might see this when in a combination of rain or drizzle and snow. It's kind of a mixture of clear and rime ice. But the peculiar thing about this is it forms this kind of mushroom compacted effect. So rather than clear or on a confined space, it sort of builds up over each other, and you get it again typically confined to the leading edges, but it's almost like this sort of waterfall effect where it sort of builds up and builds up. That's where you tend to get that sort of mixed ice conditions. Good. Okay, so that kind of covers the types of ice that we could get and probably the meteorological conditions that you would associate with that type of icing. Look, we're commercial airline pilots, and we have to fly through weather. Obviously, we don't want to fly through CBs, but we may have to navigate our way around the path of least resistance, and that may well be involved in some cumulus cloud. But during the winter time, when the temperatures are cold, like I'm looking outside today, it must be overcast at about 1,000. There's a light drizzle around. It's probably about plus 3 degrees outside. Well, a couple of thousand feet, we're going to be in the freezing level. So we're much more likely, I think, today to be seeing icing, and particularly that sort of rime ice that we spoke about earlier on. So having an understanding of that helps better prepare us of what we are likely to experience. Again, though, as pilots, there are other things associated with that weather phenomena that we want to avoid, but we know we're going to be entering into it, and a lot of it we can't avoid. So we have the ability to de-ice the aeroplane with the various protections that we have. Good. I'm just going to pause it now and have a sip of my tea, and then I'll be straight back to you. Okay, I'm back. I probably could have sipped my tea as I was talking to you, but I tend to slurp, so I don't want to put you through that either. Right, so let's have a look at the protection So ice affects all parts of the aircraft, but only certain parts of it are actually de-iced. Now, we're quite lucky on the Airbus 320 and most jet aircraft have enough bleed to provide hot air to the various leading edge surfaces and engine protection and pitot static, well, that's electric, but engine and leading edge devices to pump enough hot air. There's enough residual power to actually melt the ice. If you're flying turboprops, well, you're probably on the wrong channel, but they're slightly different. And I've flown, I don't know, what is it, 1,500 hours on Jetstream 41 as flying in the UK at sub 20,000 feet. So I've seen a lot of this, and sometimes actually, not so much on the Jetstream 41, but on the 32, they picked up a lot of ice because it's a much thicker wing profile, and they'd often have to descend because they couldn't maintain altitude because of the amount of ice that they're picking up. So that's can be quite significant. So even if you have ice protection, those aircraft obviously have a thicker wing profile, and of course boots. If you don't know what they are, it's just a pneumatic device which expands and contracts to break the ice off. But you have to be very careful about when you do that, and you have to make sure that there's a fair amount of ice accretion before you activate them. Otherwise, you end up with just the boot moving inside a nice conical, snowy leading edge that you've just created for yourself. Anyway, I digress and go off topic. That is the problem with doing these audio presentations rather than the visual presentations. It's very easy to waffle on, so forgive me for that. Right, so let's have a look at some of the ice protection. So the ice protection on the wing, and one of the things that first surprised me about jet aircraft when I was on the Boeing and now on the Airbus was there's no tail protection. It's only on the wing leading edge. So that's the first thing to understand. The ice protection on the aircraft is on the wing anti-ice is also only on the outboard slats, and from memory that's slats 3, 4 and 5, so the inboard isn't protected. So we've got slats on the wing, that's 3, 4 and 5. We have engine protection as well, that's on the nacelle. One thing to remember on this, because before we broke up with all this COVID stuff and we're flying in the winter, one of the FOs I was flying with said, well, we've got fan blade icing on the walk around. I didn't think we could get that when we put the engine anti-ice on. Well, just remember, guys, there's no heated mats on the fan, not like there is on a turboprop. So the ice is just shed by centrifugal force on the props, I've just said it myself, haven't I? On the fan. There's no de-icing for the fan blades at all. The de-icing comes, or the anti-icing, de-icing comes from the engine nacelle. That's the shiny part around the front of the engine air intake. And the whole purpose of that is to clear any ice. You imagine we spoke earlier on about this heavy impact icing and rime ice and the fact and the mixed icing, how that changes shape so much. We don't really want that on the engine intake because that upsets and disrupts the airflow. And that's what we want to do, a nice clean laminar sort of consistent airflow into the engine. So it's for the engine, it's only the engine intakes that are protected. So you can get fan blade icing with the wing anti-ice on. Okay, we've also got windshield, windscreen protection as well, and we've also got pitot and static, angle of attack, and drain masts as well. So quite a lot going on there to protect us from ice formation on the aircraft. Some of that's electric and some of that is pneumatic. Pneumatic bleed is there for the wing anti-ice and the engine anti-ice. The rest of it, of course, is all electric. Okay, good. Let's first of all take a look then at wing anti-ice. Okay, so let's take a look at wing anti-ice first of all. So this is one of the services that's provided by Bleed Air. I covered this very briefly when we looked at bleed in one of the previous videos, but here we're going to obviously expand on it because it's specific to anti-icing. So hot air from the bleed systems, that's from the engine. I'll make a note of it here. in terms of bleed sources, we can't use the APU bleed for wing anti-ice. It's one of the limitations. I spoke about that in the bleed sources again. Wing anti-ice is for the slats, okay, and that's, as I said earlier on, slats 3, 4 and 5. It only works when you're airborne. You can turn it on the ground, and it does a 30-second test, but then it turns off and then turns on again once you're airborne. So you don't have any wing anti-ice when you're taxiing around on the ground. It's only a short test. It's actually managed by the BMCs, and that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The BMCs being the bleed management computers, as that controls the rest of the bleed for the pneumatics, etc. There's also some leak detection. So if there is a leak of that hot bleed air that comes out of the wing anti-ice ducting, we don't want that going into the other parts of the wing. So that's all controlled by a leak detection computer. There are 2 loops, and just like all fire systems on the aircraft, you need both to detect a heat problem or change in resistance to actually generate a fault, or just one if one loop is inoperative. Okay, I won't go into that, it sounds a bit boring, but essentially that there is leak detection by the BMCs. Has a bleed valve that opens and closes depending on when you select the wing anti-ice. If there is a leak, then the BMCs will command the bleed valve for that wing anti-ice to close, so that you don't get any more bleed leaking into that side of the system. Okay, so that will automatically be controlled by the BMCs, and you'll have an ECAM associated with it. There's also high and low protection as well, and you can isolate it from those extremes. And depending on the type of fault that you might get, you may or may not be able to open the crossbleed. So for what I mentioned there in terms of an over temperature, then that will remain closed, and you mustn't open the crossbleed, so that we don't want any of that sort of cross contamination, and we don't want any hot air going into that broken side, if you like. So that will be an occasion there where the crossbleed has to remain closed, and then you might have to think then about your entering into icing conditions. But I'll come on to more about that a little bit later on. But essentially controlled by the BMC's 2 loops for overpressure and over temperature sensing. The engine anti-ice, well, that's a cool little thing actually, because it's actually independent of the bleed configuration. So even if you turn the engine bleeds off, you still have engine anti-ice, and that makes sense really, doesn't it? Because if that thing's still running, you still want the engine anti-ice to be working. Okay, so even with the bleeds off, it still works. It's completely independent. Like I said earlier on, it's only the engine intake that's de-iced. It's that shiny bit to ensure a smooth laminar flow into the engine. With the engine anti-ice on, and actually with the wing anti-ice on as well, there is a slight change in the max EGT you can get, and N1 increase as well. But something that's worth noting here, as we enter into the winter season, if you're taxiing around with the engine anti-ice on, and it's a long taxi, such as Amsterdam, for example, and Paris, I've had this before. You're trying to taxi quite slowly because the aprons and the taxiways are still in poor condition. So you're jabbing the brakes all the time. You've got the engine anti-ice on. It increases the N1 by, I can't remember the numbers, but about 3 or 4%, which is quite significant. Actually, the aircraft runs away with you. So you're trying to keep it nice and slow. You're jabbing the brakes, and there's a good chance there that you might overheat the brakes. So do be careful. Do be careful with that. It's regulated by 2 PRSOVs, which are pressure regulating shut-off valves. All sounds a bit complicated, doesn't it? They're electrically operated, but if the regulating valves fail, because they're electric, when the electric supply to them goes, they fail open. So you'll have the engine anti-ice on if the PRSOV fails. Nice and simple, really. Now that doesn't happen all the time. It's only if that valve fails. If you have other failures associated with it, it might close. But we'll come on to that a little bit later on. But essentially, if you lose an electrical supply to those valves, they'll just fly open, and you'll always have the engine anti-ice available to you, which is obviously better. Sort of belt and braces. Better than not having it at all. The next thing we'll look at then is windscreen icing, or windscreen anti-icing, and defogging, they call it in the FCOM. It also gives a little bit of flex in the glass for bird strikes. No one ever really talks about that, and it's not mentioned in the FCOM, but I remember someone talking to me about it. Well, I remember when we did it in our ATPLs and stuff, allowed a bit of flex in the glass, so I'm assuming that's true, but I haven't seen it written here anywhere, so that might just be my nonsense, but there we are. Probably why it's not spoken about very much, but I'm sure there's an element of truth in it. And obviously, you've got your windshield and your side window. The very, very side windows, the ones that sort of by your ears, the sort of sliding window, sorry, the one behind your sliding window, that's not defogged or de-iced, so it's only the very windshield and your side window that's actually de-iced, or that's actually anti-iced. Two windshield heat computers, they regulate and they protect against overheating, all completely autonomous. Low power on the ground, high power on the air, and the switchover is automatic. Now you can, this is, as soon as an engine is running, then the window heating and the probe heating, etc., are all automatic. I'll come on to the probe heating in a bit. But as soon as an engine's running, they all turn on. But if you want them on the ground because now you're in freezing rain or you're in snowy conditions and you're concerned about any contamination of those surfaces, including your windscreen, then if you press on the overhead button, probe heat, window heat, that will just turn them on. So if you're getting any fogging on the ground for a long period on the ground, if you pop that on, then you'll have that protected. So you have the option of turning it on, but it's automatic when there's an engine running. Good. Okay. So probes and statics then. Pitot static, AOA, TAT, TAT probes. It's controlled by 3 independent computers. One computer controls the captains, one computer controls the FO side, and one computer controls the standbys. So it's protection against overheating, and also those computers generate the faults that you might see on your eCam. Again, it's all completely powered automatically with one engine is running, or again, like I said earlier on with the window heat, probe window heat, push button on the overhead that will electrically heat those probes up for you. Interestingly, though, on the ground, the TAT probe is not heated, and the Pitot goes on to low power. I actually didn't know that as I was looking through this earlier on, but I didn't know that there were 2 temperatures for the probes, but I also didn't know that the TAT probe wasn't heated, and I don't know why it's not heated. I don't know if it's because it's really low down and you might bang your head on it. Not sure. If anyone's got any input on that, I'd be very pleased to hear from you. Okay, right. We're now going to go on to the faults that you might see. I say this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the more functional, kind of practical things that you might see, and what it might mean for us. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these faults then. I'm going to start with wing anti-ice, then we'll go on to engine and probes, etc. I've not gone through all of these because, as I say, particularly on the Pitot static stuff, it's quite exhaustive, so I've just picked out a few for you. What I have to say also is that in my experience of flying the Airbus now for 12 odd years, I've just haven't experienced any faults with this. So it's a very reliable and robust system, as you would expect it to be, and because it's a very important system. So some of the faults you might see with a wing anti-ice, one of them might be high pressure. This is just going to give you a thrust limit penalty. It's a crew advisory, and you'll see that on the eCam. It still operates though in the normal way. You might see valve remains open, so you turn the anti-ice off, but it's failed in the open position. Now, all this means is that it's going to be continuously available. So no matter what you press on the overhead panel for the wing anti-ice, turn it off, turn it on. If you turn it off, it remains on. It remains on in the open position. Or remains in the open position even if you turn it off. No big drama in the air, it's always available, but on the ground it will command you to turn the bleed on the affected side off, and the reason for that, of course, is that there's no cooling. Once the aircraft's moving through the air at a rate of knots, there's sufficient cooling to prevent any sort of over temperature of the leading edges. And that's why we don't have it on the ground. And when you press it on the ground, you only get a 30-second test specifically for that reason. So if this happens on the ground or once you land, they'll ask you to turn the bleed off for that side. Wing anti-ice fault. This is slightly different. This is when the valve fails to open, and it depends on whether you're on single and two bleed source. So let me just break it down for you. So wing anti-ice fault. If you're on single engine or if you've got a single bleed source, then the ECAN will ask you to turn the cross bleed open so you've got symmetrical anti-icing. However, if both engines are operating or you've got both bleed sources, then it will ask you to turn the wing anti-ice off. I don't think Airbus likes the cross bleed open with two bleed sources, basically. In this occasion, then, you have to remember to avoid icing conditions, the ECAN will tell you. And of course, you've got the VLS increment of 10 knots or green dot if you enter severe icing or you suspect ice accretion. So that's pretty straightforward, really. So that just depends on whether you've got one or two bleed sources operating for the wing anti-ice fault. You'll see on the overhead panel fault lights under the wing anti-ice overhead PB. Pitot static AOA. Yeah, lots can happen here, and you can go into the FCOM and look at these in a bit more detail if you like. But basically, if you get a captain or you get an FO failure, then or AOA, if I remember rightly, all it will ask you to do is put on ADR3 onto the failed side. So that's the standby. So captain or FOs, Pitot static sources, then you just put ADR3 if it's available onto the failed side. Pitot, yes. Static, exactly the same. AOA, yep, exactly the same. ADR3 if it's available onto the failed side. That's pretty straightforward, really. I don't need to talk any more about that. It's pretty self-explanatory. And again, there's more combinations of those failures, like a Pitot, captain, and FO static, and all that sort of stuff. So you can have a look at that in your own time. Engine anti-ice is the next one we'll talk about. Avoid icing conditions seems to be a fairly common theme when ice protection has failed. Basically means that the control of the nacelle anti-ice has failed. The valve is in the closed position. Avoid icing conditions. It might be actually the aircraft will ask you to increase the thrust if it's extra thrust is available to try and force the valve open. So if that works, great. Sometimes they might get sticky. The other failure you might get is valve open, and all that means is the engine anti-ice remains available. Now that might be that the shut-off valve has failed, in which case it just fails open, like I mentioned earlier on, but it's always going to be available. So a very simple system, really, because it's independent of the main bleed. There's no cross bleeding or anything. It's all controlled by those shut-off valves, and they're either working or they're not. If it's failed closed, then, or if it's closed and it's not in the right position, then you haven't got it. But if this electrical supply fails to it, it fails open and the bleed's available all the time. So it's either on or off, basically. Windshield heating, not much more to say about this, really, in as much as it's a non-monitored item for Cat 3. So if it has failed, you'll just get a master caution there, and it will say windshield heat. but that's going to affect you for your Cat 3 landing capability. It's not monitored by the aircraft FWC for your landing categories, so that won't change. But of course, if you look down there, the items that are required, that it's windshield heating for the pilot flying, and depending on your airline, if it's captains only approaches, then that's obviously going to have an effect for you depending on when it happens. Well, that's all I have for you for anti-icing. I hope you've enjoyed the briefing. Before I go, I just say a quick thank you to all those who continue very generously to support the channel, whether it be through Patreon or buymeacoffee.com. It's really appreciated, so thank you very much for that. Lots more to come on the channel, so keep safe, keep the plates spinning, and I'll talk to you again very soon.